and really,
Rabbi.
hi Mark, and learn to appreciate and understand how this mitzvah is done, what's behind the mitzvah, the history of the practice, the significance, and how to actually do it ourselves. So really, if you think about it, everybody prays. And that's what we talk about tonight's topic. Prayer, the mitzvah of prayer and doing it yourself. Really, everybody prays in some form or another. That's why they say there's no atheists in a foxhole, because everybody, once they finally get desperate, that's when the prayer comes out. Whereas they say, it may be a big debate, a lot of discussion or issues with prayer in schools. But as somebody once said, as long as there are finals and exams in schools, there's going to be prayer in schools. So whenever people get desperate and they feel like they might not make it through that exam, all of a sudden they're praying in their hearts, in their minds, on their lips, each in their own way. But as Jews, we're famous for praying. In fact, a typical Jewish holiday would be that there was a challenge, a terrible decree, a threat to the Jewish people. We prayed to God, and God saved us. In fact, that's what the Jewish people told the people of Edom as we traveled and we wanted to pass through their land on the way to Israel. We said we suffered in Egypt and we prayed to God and God saved us. So Jews are famous for praying and for finding solutions in prayer. Hi, Alex. But specifically, in Jewish tradition and practice, we pray 3 times a day. We see you now. And that's the morning prayer, shacharit, the afternoon or almost evening, end of afternoon prayer, mincha, and the evening nighttime prayer, ma'ariv. And that's why they say that NASA wanted to do some, PR and community outreach, and they invited religious leaders to come for an orbit around the atmosphere. So they had a priest and a minister and whoever else and a rabbi. And as they came back down and they got out of the shuttle, the reporters and the trip's planners and the scientists wanted feedback. So each of these leaders and religious figures goes on how beautiful the universe that God created looks from that vantage point, and how to be able to see the galaxy and appreciate the mysteries of God. And one after the other, they're waxing poetic about all this. And finally, this little rabbi comes out of the hatch of the shuttle, and he's huffing and puffing, sweating, completely disoriented, totally overwhelmed. Something is wrong. They said, "Rabbi, what's going on?" I said, "What do you mean what's going on? That was impossible. Every 90 minutes, the sun rises and the sun sets. We do a full orbit around the earth. And again, morning prayer, evening prayer, afternoon prayer. I couldn't catch my breath. It was time for the next prayer. I'm still behind 3 days worth of prayers. I'm all confused. What do you mean what's going on?" So famously, Jewish people pray 3 times a day. But where does this actually come from before NASA came around? So interestingly, and this has to do with us doing this topic today, this has its source in the temple in Jerusalem. And that's because in the original ancient holy temple that we had in Jerusalem, twice actually, there was sacrifices, offerings to God each day, which correspond to the prayers that we now have. So at this time of the year, when we're now in the 3-week mourning period, when we mourn the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, which also brought about the exile of the Jewish people, this is a time when we like to look at what was the temple and learn all about the temple and what it means and how it was actually built and used. And that itself is a form of preparation and a form of development of the rebuilding of the temple, which we hope and pray for very soon. So let's talk about this for a little bit. In the temple, they offered sacrifices to God. They give these offerings each and every day. And the prayers that we read replace that. And what that means that in the morning, there was a set morning offering. And at the end of the day, while it was still daytime, there was a set evening offering or afternoon offering. And there was no offering at night, but they kept running the process, completing the job of everything that was done by day, they completed at night. So the total would be 3. And for that, we have the 3 different prayers. And what that essentially means is that our synagogues, where we get together and pray today, are a reflection and a replacement of the temple in Jerusalem. The temple in Jerusalem was the place where God's presence was felt and we can connect to God. And now we can do that, at least to a limited extent, in every synagogue, everywhere. In fact, that's why we know that when the temple will be rebuilt, it will be a much larger and more unique version, because we won't just have the temple itself, but actually all these synagogues that we now have as homes of prayer, as mini temples where we connect to God in this way, will join up and be in a sort of extension of the temple, which will be rebuilt when the Mashiach comes. So, in a nutshell, the prayers we say are a replacement for what happened at the temple, at least to the degree that that's possible today. And that itself causes the temple, the synagogues, to really be an extension of that temple. And in fact, the same would extend to our own homes. Hi, David. The Lubavitch Rebbe insisted that our homes are also temples. Our homes are also places of God, which will be connected to the temple as well. It will be an extension of the temple as well when the Mashiach comes. And we've all seen that much more in these last few months, when it hasn't always been possible to get to the synagogue, and we needed to pray and really do all the good things that we try to do at home. So the daily offerings are the source for the daily prayers, and the reason why on Shabbat and holiday there's additional prayers is because there were additional offerings. But the question then becomes, what do offerings have to do with prayers? Isn't prayer where I ask God for stuff? The typical understanding of prayer is that something's going on or there is a need, and we ask God to help us with that need. And that's why the people are praying in the foxhole, because they're desperate and they need God to step in. What does that have to do with an offering, which seems to be some kind of ritual that we don't necessarily understand, where we're thanking God or offering something up to God? How do the two things come together? How do we replace offerings with prayer? Well, this helps us understand, and this helps us realize and remember that there's really more to prayer than asking God for stuff. We might ask God for stuff, but that's not what it's all about. Prayer is actually drawn from the Hebrew word tefillah, which would mean prayer, pronounced, as you see here, tefillah. So we translate it in English as prayer, which would mean asking for something. But tefillah, the original word, actually has a root which can be read as tofel. Hatofel is a word that appears in the Mishnah in the context of joining pieces together. Tefillah, prayer, then in the Jewish source of the word, actually means to connect. And our prayer to God is an opportunity to connect, a moment of connection, of bonding to God. I remember in my kids' preschool, they had at one point a program where they would put up outside the classroom like bullet points of what they had done that day to help the parents start a conversation with their children about what they had done in the preschool room. And they headlined it, "Conversation is Connection." They wanted to help the parents actually have that conversation with such a small child by giving them that material, because conversation is connection. That's the way you connect and bond with the child. And we think about it, we know that. Two people, two parties, two otherwise unconnected people connect by having conversation with each other, by communicating with each other. That's where the bond, that's where a relationship is established. Prayer is our conversation with God. So much more than it being a time when we ask God for things, although we do, it's a time when we connect and we bond with God. In fact, it can be said that the reason God has designed life and designed us to need things, which inevitably leads to prayer and asking and hoping for things, is in order to make sure that we'll have that connection. Those of you who have sent children off to school or wherever it may have been, may have experienced this. Those who find themselves fortunate enough to actually support their children through their higher education and maybe even provide them something for their expenses. Well, if you give the kid everything they need, you might not hear from them for a while. But if that credit card suddenly runs out, at least then they'll remember to call home. So the parent might, not that I'm advising this to anybody, but the parent might strategically say, I'm going to give a little bit less so that the child should call home and maintain that connection, maintain the relationship, and not forget about me. In that kind of way, God gives us what we need, thankfully. But sometimes we reach a point where we need to ask for it and pray for it so that we maintain a connection. That prayer, that communication, that conversation with God builds up a connection that we might otherwise forget to have with the one who created us and the one who really provides for us. So what that ends up meaning is that prayer is a very personal, a very emotional, a very internal, and a very personal thing. It's my feelings that I express to God. It's my relationship with God. It's my connection to the God who is beyond me. Well, then what's this? You might be seeing it backwards. This is a Siddur. This is a prayer book full of text. This one happens to be in Hebrew and English. Full of texts that we read in our prayers and says, read this and don't read that and stand up and sit down. How can there be a book of prayers? How can somebody prescribe what to say if it's my personal feeling, my personal relationship with God? If it's my connection, if it's my communication, bonding me with God, how can somebody provide that? It's almost like you would have a fellow going on a blind date and he's going to parrot what somebody else said. That's not going to build a relationship with whoever it is he's meeting. So for that, we really need to understand the history of the prayer book. The history of the prayer book really is that there was a point in Jewish history, particularly in the first temple period, so 2,500 plus years ago, when people did pray totally spontaneously. Those three prayers are there, or even before that became the norm. We would get up and share our thoughts with God. That was the prayer. But it came to a point when people had a hard time doing that. People had a hard time doing that, both because their Hebrew was no longer perfect, and Hebrew would be the preferred way to communicate, although definitely not the only. And their knowledge and ability to express themselves to God became more restricted, became more limited and less available. So what happens if you go into any chain supermarket, it could be a Jewel around here or any other one, you see an aisle full of greeting cards. Cards for every occasion, birthdays, births, weddings, any kind of celebration you might be going to, there's a card for. There are even cards for anniversaries. So I'm going to congratulate my dear friend or family member on their birthday with a pre-made text? I'm just going to buy it in the store and give them what Hallmark says and says, here you go. Why do people get greeting cards? Why do people even bother paying like $3.99 for those cards? I should communicate. I'm going to celebrate an anniversary and give my spouse a card that somebody else wrote and printed. But of course, it turns out that the card is only there to help. I have a feeling, I have a sentiment that I'm trying to express to somebody else. I'm trying to celebrate with the other person, express love to the other person, express feeling for, appreciation for, sympathy with, whatever it is with the other individual. And I don't always have the words or the design or the way to bring that out. The card helps me. Once I find a card that has the right expression, I can actually add my own note onto that card with my own scribble and my own signature and make that an even more personal touch. So no, nobody should be just taking a card off the shelf and feeding it to the other guy or whoever it is. What we should be choosing the one that speaks for us, adding our personal touch to it and using it. And that's the prayer book. Our prayer is a moment of prayer, of praying to God, of connecting to God. But when the Jewish people reached a point where we're no longer able to just get up in the morning and find the right words and express ourselves to God just as is, so we have some greeting cards pre-designed, which help us express what's inside of us, which help us remember what things to cover. And that's how we communicate with and connect to God. But we have to make sure it doesn't stop there. We have to make sure to put our personal feeling, our personal touch, our personal message, our personal investment in that pre-made greeting card that is the Siddur, that is the prayer book. So we really need to know that prayer is that moment of connection, and it's not just about reading the text, but about adopting the text and allowing that to express me and my communication to God. So at this point, we get to the DIY, do it yourself. How do we pray, and how can we each pray on our own? What are the guidelines? What are the basic rules there? So first of all, we have to always remember that now there's a formal structure to prayer. We have those 3 daily prayers, we have the book, we have all the rules, but that doesn't change the core. The core of prayer remains connection to God, and including, of course, asking of God when we need something. So prayer can be done in any fashion and in any time and almost any place, as long as the place is appropriate and respectful of communicating with God. So that remains. We should keep that in mind. We should never feel restricted from being able to just open up and connect to God. But how do we properly fulfill the mitzvah of daily prayer? Then how do we properly use the designed, prescribed prayers which were written by the greatest prophets of our history? So first of all, there are 3 daily prayers. Shacharit, the morning prayer, which is said in the morning. It should be done before we start our business for the day, and at the very least before midday. The afternoon prayer, mincha, which is read anywhere from about a half hour after midday to sunset. And the evening prayer, arvit, which is read after dark, after it's totally dark outside, after nightfall. These 3 prayers appear in the book, and they are preferably prayed with a minyan, meaning with 10 other Jewish adult males in a shul, in a synagogue, but that is not at all a deal breaker. The prayer can be done even totally alone, and which is more common, of course, today with all the social distancing. But as we approach these prayers, there's an excellent siddur, the one I've been showing you, that can guide us through them. This siddur doesn't just translate into English. It actually provides you very specific guidance at every step of the way how to pray, how to do it according to the best rituals of our tradition, what prayers belong when, and how to do those mitzvahs right. So if we want to do the prayer according to the prescribed fashion, which is really the ideal way of taking our own hearts and connecting to God, this prayer book, the Sidur Tilat Hashem, the annotated edition, typically appears in blue, can be an excellent resource for getting this done. And wonderfully on their part, there is actually an app for this Sidur, and I'm going to try to show that here. Here we go. So here you'll see that the annotated edition of the Sidur and app, this is available both for Android and for iPhone. This is how a typical screen of it would look. We have the exact directions appearing before each part of the prayer. Here it appears in Hebrew, but when you hit the little E, it switches to English. And as you open the Sidur app at any particular time, it automatically will populate with the prayer for that time of the day, as well as the general prayers and general rules, times, and etc. that apply. This is an app which is available for as little as $5.99, and I strongly recommend it. I'm going to post the links. I'm going to post the links for Android and App Store for this Sidur, because it's really, really a very helpful thing to have. Of course, we always need to remember that the Sidur as an app cannot be used on Shabbat or on biblical Jewish holidays when we do not use electronic devices. That would be a shameful way to pray, where we'd be praying to God but not following God's rules. So here you have, I sent to everybody in the chat, and I'm going to post it also for our online viewers, the Google Store and the App Store links for that Sidur. Really very helpful. It really does my job of the DIY, telling us all what to do and how to do it. And as we do each mitzvah, this mitzvah does it for you. Now, there's another thing to keep in mind, and that's an old Hasidic tradition of choosing a section of the prayer. Now, what that meant was that they would read all the prescribed prayers for each day at their time, but there was one section that they invested in, that they gave it more time, more thought, more meditation. They may have not had enough time and focus in their day to do that intensity for all the prayers, but there was one section or one prayer where they gave that more. And I would kind of, do something similar for some of us who regular prayer may be new for us. Let's choose a prayer. Choose the morning prayer, choose the evening prayer, choose a prayer that you're going to start with, or choose a section of the prayer that you're going to start with. It can be the Shema, which would be the most important prayer. It could be the Shemona Esrei, the Amidah, when we talk directly to God. We ask God for our many needs. But choose a prayer or choose a section of a prayer that you're going to adopt and try to do regularly. That prayer can be read in any language. God hears any language. In fact, it's interesting when the Talmud discusses different things that we read and whether they could be read in a language other than Hebrew, there's evidence for each one. When we read this passage, there's scriptural source or evidence or some other way of knowing, some other source material to tell us that it's okay to read this in another language. When it comes to prayer, the Talmud says, how do we know it's okay to pray in another language? How do we know? It's obvious, because prayer means to ask of God, to talk to God, to connect to God. And obviously, without any need for some scripture to prove it, obviously that can be done in any language that we can communicate in, because God hears that all. So as you pray in the language of your choosing, try to actually say the words. I know sometimes it's counterintuitive. We think of the prayer as a feeling in the heart. And of course, the feeling is the main part of it. But the mitzvah of prayer is performed by saying those words, by explicitly, intangibly communicating to God by saying those words. And actually saying it helps us focus. Yes, Linda?
Is there a guide that can help you translate or learn the Hebrew, like a transliteration, if you can't read it? Or is it just Hebrew and English?
Yeah, so this particular Siddur is mostly Hebrew and English, but in the printed version, and maybe I'll send a link for that as well. In the printed version of the Siddur in the back, you have many transliterations of primary prayers. So the Shema prayer will appear in its main page in Hebrew and in English, but in the back you have transliterated so you can actually read it in Hebrew in English letters. So yes, you could say the words, and again, you can even say those words in English. That also counts, and that's saying the words of prayer, bring them to life for us, as well as bring them tangibly in the world around us. When we say something, it moves beyond our minds and our hearts into reality, at least a little bit. And that helps draw it down, that helps make it happen. So when we're asking God, we're talking to God about whatever it is, when we say it tangibly, it brings it closer to the reality that we hope for. So let's try to each start with a prayer, start with a section of a prayer, read that prayer, focus on that prayer, keep our heart on that prayer, and grow from there, growing both to add more of the prayers until we find ourselves ready to do all three prayers each day, and growing in the feeling and the focus and attention that we actually put in from our hearts and minds into the prayers as we read them and as we connect to God as we do so. I'll just comment and post a link again that I gave a more full talk on this some time ago during our course with All My Heart. Maybe some of you had attended. I'm just going to post a video of that in case anybody would like to watch a more full version of the class on this topic. There you go. And meanwhile, we will conclude this DIY do-it-yourself mitzvahs class on prayer. Thursday, we will have a special presentation out of the regular series of Talmudic Wisdom for Life. We're going to talk about Maimonides, Rambam, one of the greatest giants of our history and a recognized philosopher and physician, even outside of Jewish circles. This is a celebration of the conclusion of the annual cycle of the study of Maimonides, the study of the Rambam, and we're going to talk about his very unique and dramatic life story and his very central and critical works, which remain important to this very day, 800 years later. So that's going to be an interesting historic and learning experience we're going to do on Thursday. Same Zoom link, same YouTube channel, same Facebook page at 8 o'clock. So I hope to see you there. It's going to be a blend, shall we say, of this kind of discussion, a couple video presentations, and really getting into what it's all about. In the meantime, have a wonderful week. I'm going to stop the live stream and stay on in case anybody